Good morning on the East Coast. I'm Joshua Walker here at Japan Society in New York, and I couldn't be more excited to be talking to you this morning here on the East Coast. And good evening, konbanwa, to those joining from Japan. I'm excited to be talking to you about the topic that's on everyone's mind. 2 weeks before the most consequential election the U.S. and maybe the world has ever had, we've got an all-star panel today to talk about the implications, not just the big picture, but what does this mean for our community, not only the U.S. Japan community, but the community that cares about both nations and business. So we've got an all-star panel. You can see them on the screen right here. We have Ann Guerin, who's the White House correspondent from the Washington Post. Good morning, Ann. Thank you for joining us. We have Toshi Nakayama sensei from Keio University joining us from Tokyo. Thank you so much for joining us, Toshi. And we have Candy Wolf from Citibank joining us. Candy's down in DC. Thank you so much for joining us. Let me jump right in without me giving any prognostication. And you're there in the belly of the beast, in the heart of Washington, working for the Washington Post. What's the current political landscape? What's kind of the general 2 weeks ahead kind of landscape that you're giving our viewers today?
Well, it won't surprise you or anyone to know that the current landscape is just incredibly divided and very chaotic. That said, the race between President Trump and his challenger, Democrat Joe Biden, has been remarkably static for really 2 months. Biden has maintained a lead, which has shrunk a bit nationally and shrunk a bit in key states where the race is going to be decided. But he has remained ahead, and he has remained ahead in preferences when voters are asked, who do you think would do a better job of handling the coronavirus? Who do you trust more in foreign policy? And now, increasingly, voters are saying that they think that Joe Biden would do a better job with the economy. That was the one area in which President Trump consistently pulled ahead of Biden this year in terms of that sort of open-ended question. Who do you think would do a better job with handling the economy? Trump always was ahead. He is now only very slightly ahead. Some of the latest polls have Biden within the margin of error on that question. So that's all very bad news for President Trump, and he has a very short time in which to make up the ground that he's made up some ground, but he has a very, very short time, just 2 weeks from today, to make up the rest of the ground. So you see the Trump campaign focusing extremely hard on just a very, very small number of states that is getting smaller. The Trump campaign predicted yesterday very confidently that they will win Florida. They have very good reason to be extremely confident that they will win Florida, but it is extremely close, within the margin of error in many of the most recent polls. So setting Florida aside, which has the most, Florida is important because it has the most electoral votes at stake. Then we get to Pennsylvania and Ohio. The Trump campaign is quite confident that Ohio will, as they put it, come home for President Trump. Biden says he also thinks he's going to win Ohio. I am not going to venture a guess on who will. It's very close, but Biden has been ahead there, and he's not really ever lost that advantage. And then in Pennsylvania, probably the most consequential state this year. It's always important. It's always a key battleground state. A lot of electoral votes at stake, a big urban-rural divide, a real interesting split between Republican and Democrat. Many of the people who voted for President Trump in Pennsylvania in 2016 are registered Democrats who were disaffected with the party, did not like Hillary Clinton, did not like the party platform that year, and Trump appealed to them. Those are the people that the Trump campaign are trying to keep inside the boat this time. Pennsylvania had looked like it had gotten away from Trump about, I'd say 6 weeks ago. They are closing the gap there, but it remains very close, and Biden does remain ahead.
Thank you, Anne. I mean, there's so many pieces of this that I want to pick up on and go down. I think, the point you've raised is not just about the presidential election. It's also whether there's a coming blue wave in the Senate, the House, et cetera, that has an impact on all these things. So I want to get into that. But before I do that, let me turn it to Toshi Sensei there in Tokyo. Toshi, you were in DC a long time. You've covered these things. You kind of are the top expert in Japan looking at these issues. How do you explain what's happening to the Japanese, and how do you look at this in a broader context? And how are Japanese looking at this election in 2020 with everything else going on in the world?
Right. I guess. Well, thanks for having me, Josh. It's great to be here. And I guess how the Japanese public is perceiving what's going on in the U.S. I think it's sort of a mix of a sense of amazement and pity, I guess, and that many of us are worried whether American democracy is okay, right? And for many of the Japanese, American presidential election is sort of like a celebration of democracy, including its chaotic nature, right? We know that it's chaotic, but still, it's a textbook case of participatory democracy, a celebration of democracy. And therefore, and Josh, I think you know this, but we tend to pay too much attention to what's going on in the U.S. A whole bunch of Japanese journalists are following the campaigns. I don't know how many there are altogether, but if you see a group of Asian, it's mostly Japanese journalists, right? So sometimes it's too much, and I personally benefit from it because people do ask me questions. But this time around, usually I can enjoy presidential election, although it's a serious, political process. There's an aspect of spectator sports, right? But this time around, because the choice is so serious, I have no luxury in enjoying it. I am so worried. Right? And what I worry is that my students at the university, even younger kids, are seeing Mr. Trump and what he's doing and what he's saying, and they see him as a symbol of the United States. So the image of America is imprinted to these younger generation through Mr. Trump. That's what I worry about most. For instance, the first president that my son, who is 12 years old right now, President Obama was the first sort of president he noticed as an American president, right? But now you have Mr. Trump, and he's all confused now, right? Like what kind of country U.S. is. And looking at the debate, about 2 weeks ago, it was a disaster, right? I guess presidential election is one of the most political institutions, but it was totally destroyed. And there was this commentary in the U.S. that it was neither Biden nor Trump who lost, it was the United States. And I think that pretty much says everything. So I think, recovering from this negative backlash, I think it's going to take some time. Just selecting someone other than President Trump won't change all that much. So, we are worried. And again, we look at what's going on in your country with a sense of amazement, and I guess for the first time with pity.
Well, that's a very sobering way, but I appreciate the perspective. I think sometimes it's very useful to get an outside perspective when we're so close to the action. So speaking of being close to the action, we have Candy Wolf, who's the managing director and head of government and global affairs for Citi. And I should have started by, I was so excited to get to you guys. I didn't even thank our sponsors of the business and policy, which seems appropriate now, given that Citi and Deloitte are global leaders, and we have corporate partners at Mizuho Financial Group and Toyota Motor of North America. So Candy, having that said, one of the important constituencies that's watching this, not just from the Japanese perspective that Toshi-san has eloquently laid out for us, is the markets. How are the markets either factoring in what could be one of the craziest presidential elections, given we don't know what the outcome could be and given the incumbent's rhetoric, but also in general, we're in a state of financial crisis and a public health crisis as well. How is the market and how is the kind of private sector beginning to respond to what's happening right now leading to November 3rd in the election?
Thanks, Josh, and thanks for the invitation to be here with everyone. Markets have a lot of volatility, and it's always hard to say what did the markets think, because it's not the real economy, as we know. But having said that, I think where things stand today, and I talked to my equity analyst so I could make sure I was accurate in my depiction of where we thought the markets, of course, they haven't opened yet this morning, so we'll see where they are next day, since they're reacting to stimulus or no stimulus, which we can talk about in a bit. But in terms of today, the market is factoring in and assuming that Vice President Biden wins fairly significantly. I think the national polling numbers, as Ann noted, I think the election is tighter than the national numbers are conveying, but the markets are kind of looking at the national numbers and saying Biden's up by, 8 to 9 to 10 points, depending on whether you take averages or individual polls. But so they're factoring in a fairly large Biden win, and the fact that there's likely to be a blue wave, which I think we can kind of talk about what's going to happen in the Senate and how realistic that outcome is. And so the market's initial reaction, assuming that's the outcome, and assuming we know what that outcome is on either November 3rd or by November 4th, then I think the market's going to be fairly positive in the sense that they're going to have a sigh of relief that we don't have a drawn out process. What I think is interesting is not so much what the outcome or the policy issues are, but the fact that there's a decision, because the tail risk and the concern that the market has is that it will be really close, that we're not going to know the outcome. It's going to be very contested, and it's going to get really ugly. And then the market, is at the moment, they are sort of comfortable that we won't be in a contested place. But I think if it gets tighter and some of these numbers sort of suggest that this race is going to be more competitive than perhaps the market's indicating, in which case we could see a reaction, from the markets the day after the election, if it's not clear that there's a winner on election night.
So taking that scenario that Candy-san just gave us, and you talked about some of the issues in the states and the battleground. I guess a lot of us in the states feel a sense of deja vu, because this feels a lot like 2016, where the front page of the New York Times said that she had a 91% chance of winning 4 years ago today. Given the polls, that's the impression that one would be left feeling. What are the issues that are driving this election? Is this really just about COVID and kind of the response to COVID or lack thereof from the president? Is this about the incumbent, or are there other factors that have been playing out that we have to look at? And what are you paying attention to as a reporter there in Washington?
Well, I mean, Joshua, I think that by far the overwhelming issue is the pandemic and President Trump's handling of it. And that has continued to be a main driver in the way the race has shaped out for months now, despite the president and Republicans in general's best efforts to change the subject. And I mean, you see it in the way campaigning is happening physically, the way voting is happening physically. I mean, just, the president can't get away from it. And everything about the election this year, is being shaped and formed by people's reactions to the pandemic, their personal situations, the economic effects, the health effects. It is by far the single most prominent, prevalent issue. Behind that are a number of things that are in some ways related and in some ways not. The economy generally, how people are feeling about their own personal economic prospects. In some cases, in many cases, that has been affected by the pandemic, but not for everyone. So, there's a where you sit is where you stand, issue going on there. Do you feel better off for the 4 years of the Trump presidency? In many cases, people's answer to that is yes. Their stock portfolios, their 401k, their retirement. In many cases, particularly for higher income people, they are better off economically. And that is something that the Trump campaign tries very, very hard to remind people of. But then you have now, 9 months or so of economic uncertainty that really changes the way people feel when they go into the voting booth, or increasingly when they fill out a mail-in ballot and already send it. I mean, we have more than 27 million, and it's actually got to be over 30 million now. People have already voted, and many, many, many more will vote early starting Monday. So a lot of what President Trump is trying to do now, when I said earlier that he's got a very short time to make this up, I mean, it's shorter even than the 2-week calendar, because so many people have already voted and will continue to vote. He has less and less time to make that up. I think the other main issues that we hear voters talking about beyond the pandemic and the interrelated economic issues are also ones that generally do not play particularly well for the president, and that is, America's role in the world, respect for the United States around the world. What kind of country do you want to live in? Those kind of open-ended polling questions that are oftentimes pretty good predictors of what will be the main deciding factors. Are ones that Joe Biden tries very hard to show, we're not going to be that he wouldn't be a throwback president, but that he would restore certain elements of I think, the way Toshi put it was good, right? There's some basic issues of democracy at work here, and those are hard to quantify in polling, and they're hard for voters to give voice to and put their finger on. But what we do know is that, in polling questions that sort of generally get at that, many voters say they're tired, they're exhausted by the chaos. They want something, they want a greater sense of stability. They want some kind of a restoration of a sort of normal American role in the world and a normal American presidency. And so those are, again, those are issues that generally favor Biden over Trump.
Thank you. So Toshi-san, turning back to you, picking up exactly where Ann-san left off, you talked about the kind of the shock and kind of surprise and entertainment factor of the presidential election in Japan. But this is also serious business in terms of Japan's largest security ally. The bedrock of the Japanese economy has always been its close relationship. America is Japan's kind of main ally in the world. And if they're watching what's happening in the U.S., not just the domestic politics, but also its response to the COVID-19, how will the outcome of the presidential election impact Japan, your son, not just from a perception of its view on the world, but also your economy, your own foreign policy and security relations in the region?
Right. Fortunate or unfortunately, I don't know which, but I don't think there will be that much of a huge change. And that's, I guess, very different from other, U.S. allies. I guess Japan sort of is in a special position because we somehow managed the Trump storm. It was out of luck, partly, but partly it was a result of sheer determination to embrace him and some sort of strategic calculation on the side of Prime Minister Abe. It sort of worked out. So I think we have somewhat weathered the Trump storm. So we haven't actually, well, there were some pressures, there were some unpredictable, issues that made us really worry, but it didn't sort of result into any specific huge issues, right? So, and also in terms of economy and trade, there are, always, as we do, some issues, but not a significant one. And in terms of alliance management, I think we're pretty good, right? So this Trump destroy the alliance relations doesn't necessarily sort of fit with, how they dealt with they dealt U.S. Japan alliance. It's been it hasn't been perfect, but it's been okay. And also in terms of, Japan adapting to Mr. Trump, I think Japan's adaptation was really radical. But in terms of, the whole sort of grand scheme of things, Japan's foreign policy per se, I think there has been, a constant, like us focusing on TPP. We maintain sort of the global outlook of, Japan's foreign policy. We have been searching for a, stable, not an easy relations, but a stable, Japan-Sino relations. And in Japan, there's almost like near consensus that U.S. Japan relations is important. Therefore, people supported what Prime Minister Abe did generally. And even on the U.S. side, there are this perception that Japan is an important country. And you don't see a partisan divide in that, as you see in other sort of foreign policy issues. So there's somewhat of a consensus on the both sides. So we weathered the storm. So whoever comes, I think Japan would try to adapt. And there's a foundation where we would be able to adapt. So I was joking all the time that if the Democrats had chosen Bernie Sanders, we would have embraced him. We would have told him that Japan is a quasi-socialist country. And we actually agree with the idea. So we will try to embrace Mr. Trump, but we can also embrace Mr. I don't know whether he would hug back, right? But that's what we tried. So I don't think there was a whole, there won't be a huge difference.
Thank you. So Candy, taking the same question about how the business community is looking at this, you talked about the idea of looking at this as more in terms of what could happen in the Senate and Congress. When you look at the actual policy issues that businesses and the private sector care most about, and the markets as well care about, what are those issues that people are kind of most concerned about? Is there a stark difference between the kind of the political rhetoric, but the actual policy choices that this administration has made versus what Biden is promising for a future administration?
I think pointing back to something Ann said, just noting that, this election is a referendum on President Trump and not really a policy choice around, we can talk about what's the impact, and health is clearly the number one issue, coronavirus. But beyond that, there really hasn't been a big debate around policy. So in order to sort of get to the heart of what you think are going to be some of the policy issues that are going to ultimately come out of this process, we have to look to, proposals that certainly the Biden campaign has put together, the transition team is working on. We have unity proposals that I think have, attempted to achieve consensus on the Democratic side between the different issues. And then with President Trump, there's been, very little that's said about what a Trump second term will look like. And so we're sort of expecting it would be more of the same, and we'll have to define what the same means. But if I just look at the domestic issues and try to do a comparison between a Biden and a Trump administration, the first thing we're going to want to look at is who are the personnel. Right? Personnel is policy in an administration. It's particularly true depending on who controls the Congress, because if the Congress remains divided, it's going to be difficult to get policy issues passed, because you're going to need more consensus. And therefore, issues that you really want to achieve are going to be in the control of the administration through executive orders, as you've seen been used by a number of presidents, including clearly President Trump, and then through regulation. And so who ultimately sits in the various seats that are going to be controlling government is going to matter from a business perspective in terms of whether it's going to be viewed as pro-business or viewed as, more difficult for business. I don't want to say it's anti, because I don't think that's necessarily the case, but just what's going to be more supportive. Some areas, trade and investment, for example, both candidates have a strong America built platform, as I call it, America made. Vice President Biden has a very strong America made in America platform. And so while the approach for a Biden administration may be more multilateral, use of multilateral organizations, perhaps less directly confrontational, probably not the use of tariffs as a bludgeoning tool in order to seek action. But there's going to be continued trade pressures even within a Biden administration and within a Congress. And we can talk about TPP and whether or not we think that's something that can actually get through. I think Vice President Biden has indicated that's not something he's likely to move on, and I don't see the support in Congress for passing that. So there's still going to be a pressure to protect U.S. interests, and in particular around the environment and labor. So I would hearken to the USMCA as probably that type of trade agreement that could achieve Republican and Democrat support in terms of getting something through Congress. The other areas of divergent will certainly be in tax, where there's going to be, we can go into more detail, but corporate, international, individual are all, sort of on the table for increases in a Biden administration potentially. And for Trump, I think it's more about making permanent some of the cuts that he's already proposed. Finally, climate, it's going to be one area where there's a clear divergence, right? And where we've seen the divergence, much more focus around with the Biden administration, really around infrastructure funding, green. I don't want to say it's Green New Deal because it's not Green New Deal, but it's the greening of the economy and the investment in infrastructure. Less likely that we'll see a carbon tax that will flow from that. And if it's a Trump administration, more pro-energy types of regulation probably will be the focus. Finally, I think, with respect to, a Biden administration and the dialogue that's occurring now, we'll expect to see more stimulus spending, whether it's in the space of infrastructure or it's COVID relief, depending on how you want to define stimulus. I think you'll see a much bigger package and total dollars getting into the 2 and 3 trillion versus if it were a Trump administration, where we're already seeing much lower numbers coming from the Senate and probably just an overall sort of amount of stimulus being lower with respect to a Trump administration.
Thank you. So, Anne, you're following this unprecedented campaign and just the way it's playing out. And, just the slogans and the taglines have been fascinating, right? It was originally Keep America Great. Then it went back to Make America Great for the Trump administration with America First. And then on the Biden side, it was really restoring the soul of America and kind of the focus on this pandemic in terms of the campaigning mostly being done in a virtual space. And even when people get together, they're staying in their cars, and very different than the president's flying into a city at an airport, very little social distancing. I mean, just in terms of the split screen of these two candidates, they seem stark on the outside. What are the kind of the things that you're watching for on a broader level? Some of the issues Candy just raised, I'd love your response in terms of what it means in terms of the down ballot kind of elections and how that's going to impact the presidential, particularly in some of the states that we were all surprised by last time, places like Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. That seems to be one of the bellwethers that's coming up stronger this time than even Florida that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Well, Josh, I'll take a couple parts of that. Let's do the upper Midwest first. That is the old blue wall in American politics that Trump breached in 2016. That was the thing that was the real gut punch to Democrats. I mean, obviously losing the presidential election was a big deal, but how they lost it was, really rocked the Democratic Party because Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota went for a Republican and went pretty big for a Republican, and white women in those states voted against the white female candidate. I mean, it was pretty amazing. A lot of those dynamics are not shaping up to look like they're going to happen again this year. So there's a certain sense. I should caveat this. If you talk to Democrats, they say we're worried. We're not taking anything for granted. We are not complacent. This is not 2016. We do not believe that Joe Biden is going to run away with this. We're worried. That is the line, and people really are wringing their hands on the Democratic side, worried that this thing that seems like it's in the bag really isn't. That said, their level of confidence about the upper Midwest is really striking. They feel like they addressed that problem, hit it hard. Biden is not campaigning in person very much at all, as you noted, but they are doing a lot of surrogate events. He has at least made a pass through those states and will return for these rather odd, socially distanced campaign events he's doing. But voters seem to be responding to it. They seem to think that it's that former Vice President Biden is campaigning in a responsible way. And despite President Trump's efforts to paint Biden as a prisoner of his basement and as weak for not somehow confronting the virus more physically, basically more viscerally, then that is not really landing with swing voters, with the people whom the president needs to win back. It plays very well with his core base of supporters, but it's just not, he's not widening the circle in the way he needs to. And then another thing you mentioned was on policy. I completely agree with Candy that climate is probably one of the first places that we would see a difference from a theoretical President Biden. He has vowed to rejoin the Paris Climate Accords on the first day or thereabouts. That is a thing he can do. And then beyond that, depending on the makeup of the Senate, he may have greater leeway to make some other policy changes in the climate sphere. I definitely think that's going to be something that they try to do early. It would give President Biden a real thing to show the left wing of the Democratic Party, which is voting for him, but it may not be super extra, exuberantly enthusiastic about doing so. It's a way that he could demonstrate solidarity with that wing of the party, and really make a symbolic change from the previous administration. And then, I don't know if you want to talk about the Senate map, but we can do that as well. You just let me know if you want to do that.
Great. We'll come back to that in the next round. So Toshi Sensei, in terms of how this is going to play out, I loved your analogy where you basically said, look, Japan values the U.S. relationship so much that whether the president's Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, we can be flexible. You now have a new prime minister, and I think there was a lot of fear early on that only Prime Minister Abe could manage a personality quite like Donald Trump. What does a Prime Minister Suga do? What is his top priority in terms of a new president, whether it's a new administration with Biden as president or an old friend like Trump? Does he call Shinzo Abe out of retirement to become his kind of Trump whisperer? Like how if you're giving advice to Prime Minister Suga, what does he do to keep that relationship strong and keep the U.S. Japan relationship great?
Well, I think it's going to be very difficult for Prime Minister Suga to maintain. Well, if Mr. Trump gets reelected, I think it's going to be really difficult for Prime Minister Suga to maintain the relationship Prime Minister Abe had with President Trump, because it was really personal, I assume. And one of the reasons why Mr. Abe was a favorite of Mr. Trump was that among the leaders of the Western democracy, I guess Prime Minister Abe was the only leader who wasn't really making fun of Mr. Trump. Whereas I guess everybody else was, right? Look, was it the NATO summit in 2019 when Macron and Trudeau was sort of making fun of him and the mic picked up and all that? And Prime Minister Abe didn't do that. So I guess Mr. Trump really appreciated, Prime Minister Abe's sort of attitude and approach toward Mr. Trump. So, but still, like again, I said this was like half sheer determination and calculation, but half out of luck, because it was literally personal chemistry. So we had Ron Yasu relationship, the Reagan Nakasone, and we had the Bush Koizumi relationship, which both were really personal. But I think this Donald Shinzo relationship went far beyond that. So I don't think Prime Minister Suga cannot sort of revive that. And also, Prime Minister Suga doesn't play golf either, so that's not good news too. And if it was Biden, it's kind of interesting because Biden has been the vice president. He has been the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for a long time. There isn't all that much politician who knows Biden personally. So what has Biden been doing in Asia, right? Maybe he was too focused on transatlantic relations. I don't know what it is, but there aren't that much politicians here and leaders here who actually know a candidate Biden personally. But if it would be difficult for Prime Minister Suga to establish this personal chemistry with President Biden, I guess it doesn't really matter all that much because Biden would handle the relations in a traditional way. Personally, chemistries do matter, but in a Biden administration, I think you can somehow manage it. But under Trump, personal chemistry is critically important. So I would recommend Prime Minister Suga to stop playing golf. That's the only idea I have.
Or I guess he's a karate master, as far as I know. So maybe Donald Trump will become part of his WrestleMania and the karate side. We'll see. That image is a little scary. So
President Trump is a Hall of Famer, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right, Andy, let's go to you. I do want to get to the broader map of American politics and thinking about the states as well. But also one of the challenges we always have in trying to explain the presidential system is just kind of, hey, yes, there's a national election for the president and the vice president, but then there are all these Senate races. Some of them are very much driven by policy, as you said, about climate and some of the coast and some of the worst fires we've seen this year ever, or kind of hurricanes and the kind of climate area you pointed out as being a big area. But also some of this just goes down to retail politics and also about deals that are being cut, about taxes and how much stimulus money and how much kind of contracts are being given. And in a world in which the stimulus package seems to be the most important talked about thing, the most eager man in Washington, Secretary Treasury Mnuchin and Pelosi, are trying to get a deal done from the Middle East to the Capitol, and they've only got today to get it done so they can get it before the election. What are your expectations on that, and how would that affect? And then more broadly, the question about taxes. What are you expecting from kind of the Biden administration, given that Trump keeps on using this to try to bring the conversation back to the economy and how he's been so good for the American economy before this so-called virus or the Chinese virus, as he calls it, came from Wuhan to really destroy the American economy?
So you've asked the $2 trillion question. Is there going to be a stimulus package? For those of us, and Ann's been in Washington a while, and I've been in Washington way too long, and deals come together when you least expect deals to come together, and everybody sort of predicts that they fall apart before they actually sort of have a consensus. I think the challenge with stimulus has been, particularly for COVID relief round 3, is there's been this lack of sort of both a deadline and a need. Both sides had different reasons. I think President Trump is coming to the table because he sees, and he has, Powell and others saying that it's really important for the economy to be able to get more stimulus funding. He wants to ensure, as Ann noted, that the economy has strong numbers for him. I'm not sure how much that will really have an impact in the next 2 weeks, to be honest, because the polling is going to be different and people's perceptions are going to be different. But, getting a deal certainly, I think, could help show that he's helping to stabilize the economy and try to get back some of that message. For Speaker Pelosi, it's been, less, it's been more about, I want to get what I need to get. Not entirely clear that there's an interest in getting to a deal with the president to have him have a win. At the same time, I think there's now a shift and a recognition that if Vice President Biden wins, as he's showing signs that he will or could, certainly given where the numbers stand today, then if you're the Biden transition team, do you want to have to do COVID relief in the first 3 months of your administration, or would you prefer to have Congress try to deal with it so that you can focus on other economic stimulus, you can begin to turn to things that you think are going to be important to continue to stabilize the economy, but you take the relief part, the support for unemployment, the support for small businesses, the additional stimulus money for individuals, and you take that off the table. And I think there's some willingness now to sort of suggest that perhaps there's a deal to be had that would get the issue off the table. I think the challenge, because we're in an election cycle, is that if it doesn't happen before the election, it's hard to see whether, particularly if Republicans lose the Senate, why they are going to come to the table and support a broader package after the election. So we've been sort of assuming it's pre-election or it's January, with December and November not really that realistic around sort of consensus, because lame duck sessions of Congress, as we call them, tend to be very lame, particularly if a party loses. And so the things that can get done are limited. They get done on what has to happen, and most issues will likely get punted into a potential Democrat House, Democrat Senate, and a Democrat president. Like, why would you cut the deal? If the Senate Republicans hold the Senate, there may be a willingness to do a deal in November and December, because the makeup of the Congress will look basically the same. So I think there's a lot of unknowns. We'll see if there's consensus. Legislation takes time for details. They're still working through the details. And as we saw with other, like the CARES Act, which was the first COVID relief bill, even when an agreement was reached, it took a while to get it drafted. And Congress just has to go through that process of drafting and passing, and the time is getting short. So I'm not saying it can't get done. It certainly can. We'll see if they reach a consensus. But I think from a market perspective, there's sort of this assumption that it's probably going to be more money if it's after the election, and certainly in January, if in a Biden administration, than it's going to be now. So the market's going to look at just as a timing question. When do you need it? They're assuming that it's going to happen regardless. It's just more of a timing. So maybe I'll leave it at that, and we can talk taxes after Ann talks about what might happen with the Senate, because there's going to be some issues with what's potentially likely depending on the makeup of the Senate in terms of what policy can happen.
Yeah, let's go right into that, Ann. What Senate races are you watching most carefully? Obviously, there have been big headlines, the amount of money that some of these candidates have been raising, some surprises that we wouldn't have been talking about. South Carolina is not one I thought I'd be talking about this close to the election. What, not just the Senate races themselves, but where that has a major impact on the broader election, where having a Biden versus a Clinton, you talked about the suburban women vote. Clearly, with the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been a re-energizing of the African-American vote that really propelled Vice President Biden to the nomination. But then also, when we look at evangelical Christians and kind of what groups are you looking at, and then what Senate races, and then how do those map onto the battleground? Very easy question, obviously, to unpack.
Oh, yeah. I knocked that one out. So actually, it's easier than you might think, Joshua, because a number of those things overlap. Let's take the African-American vote. Three of the most competitive races that we are watching as potential flips in the Senate are North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. In each of those states and races, African-American turnout, enthusiasm is a huge factor. Each of those states in the middle and middle South and lower South have a significant African-American populations and a long history of very active African-American voting. And in South Carolina, you have an African-American challenger to Lindsey Graham, who probably most folks watching now are very familiar with. He's been a fixture in Washington for decades. He just ran the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings for the open seat on the Supreme Court. He's a person who has been very, very close, had become very close to President Trump. Kind of turned himself into a policy pretzel to do it, but has really been at President Trump's right hand in the Senate for now nearly 4 years, he is in danger from the challenger, Jamie Harrison, who was the former Democratic state party chair in South Carolina. I don't know how many people had a chance to watch the debate that they did about 10 days ago, but it was a real debate. Lindsey Graham is a great debater, always has been. He's super quick on his feet. He's a former prosecutor, he's a lawyer, he's really good at it. Jamie Harrison was really, really good. It's a fantastic debate if you, for policy geeks, American politics geeks, if you want to YouTube it, it's really interesting. And voters in South Carolina would have learned a great deal from watching that. And they have a real choice in front of them. That is a potential Democratic pickup. If you want to just go, on the math side, Democrats are going to lose. I mean, I cannot imagine that this is going to change. They are going to lose the weird Senate seat pickup that they had in Alabama. The circumstances of Senator Jones's victory there are just not going to be replicated. It's a red state. Democrats are going to lose that one, and they know it, and they're not spending a lot of money trying to defend it. Everybody really likes Doug Jones, but sorry, dude, that's just not going to happen. Is sort of the basic Democratic view on that. However, Democrats are almost certainly going to pick up a seat in Arizona, where Mark Kelly, former astronaut, really interesting guy, is almost certain to defeat the special election winner in that state, Martha McSally, who is also a very interesting person, former fighter pilot. So it's a real very, very interesting dynamic there in Arizona. One of the things that people will be watching in that race is the share of the Latino Hispanic vote that both candidates are able to marshal. Both are white, both are significantly removed in their life experience from that of the state's very, very large Hispanic Latino population. However, both are courting Hispanic voters very heavily, and it appears quite likely that not only will Mark Kelly win, but that he will bring with him among the highest, if not the highest, turnout for Hispanic voters in Arizona in a Senate race, which is something that Democrats have been trying to do for a very long time, and to expand the map that way. Arizona is a swing state. It's one of the states in the country where population is growing. It is growing across demographics. It is a very, very young state. So there are a lot of reasons that Democrats want a strong foothold in that state, and Kelly might give it to them. Then there are a couple of other states where Democrats have a chance to pick up. We talked about South Carolina, North Carolina. There's also a chance to pick up, and in Georgia, potentially some others. But it's really tight, and I am not far from confident in predicting that Democrats can retake the Senate. It's super, super tight.
I saw Candy's hand go up. Please, Candy, jump in.
Yeah, I was going to chime in on Ann's point for a minute. I think as we've been, as you kind of look out across the Senate, as Ann said, if you think about what the Senate is today, it's 53 Republicans. It'll be 54 with the Alabama pickup. So for Democrats to gain control of the Senate, they need to pick up a net 4 seats. And either they need straight up majority, or they need to be able to get to 50-50 and the vice president breaks the tie to give the majority, right? So there's 3 sort of easy pickups. As Ann said, Arizona, I'd add Colorado, and I'd add Maine as probably the most likely pickups in the Democratic side. After that, you have to start figuring out what's that next one. And I think if we take a look at it, it's North Carolina. And the reason for that, before you get to a South Carolina, Georgia, and an Iowa, which I would also throw in there. So I think for the Democrats, they have many more opportunities to pick up seats, anywhere from 3 to 7, possibly as high as 8. And if it's a really good night for Biden, there's more of a wave. And I think what's really happened is there's a correlation between the Senate seat and the presidential seat. And that polling has showed much more of a correlation since 2014 in terms of that alignment between how a state votes for president and how you vote for the Senate. So Josh, as you noted, while there's a lot of particularities and there's a lot of individual personalities, it has been the case that there's less ticket splitting, as we call it in the US, and much more alignment with the top of the ticket. So, tell me who wins North Carolina for the presidency, and I can tell you who's likely to win the Senate seat. Because if Trump pulls off a win in North Carolina, he's probably going to carry the Senate candidate with him. If Biden pulls off a win in North Carolina, he's probably going to pull the Senate candidate with him, even though the Senate candidate may have a set of scandals associated with him and the other one has COVID. So, I think that, so I'm not saying it's a pure guarantee, but I do think there's a lot to be said for how ultimately the top of the ticket, which is why it's tight, because if you look at those battleground states, President Trump needs to win North Carolina in order to win this election. Pennsylvania is critical, Florida is absolutely critical, but his path to victory is still going through North Carolina and Arizona for 2 potential wins. It doesn't mean that he carries every candidate with him, as we see, because I wholeheartedly agree that it's just difficult for McSally to win, even if President Trump were to eke out a victory in Arizona. But my point being, we're all going to be watching from a business community what's going to happen, because is it a 50-50 Senate? Is it a 51 Senate? Is it a 53 Democrat Senate? And maybe if I spend a moment, kind of what does that size matter? I think the bigger the victory, the more pressure is going to be on the Democrat Party and Biden in particular to make changes to the process in the Senate in order to go big and go bold. The tighter the victory, the harder it is to make changes to what is the Senate structure. What am I talking about? I'm talking about the Senate filibuster. And I can walk on this because I spent 8 years in the Senate doing policy and process. So, the filibuster was sort of that sacrosanct process that no one understands. And why in any other government would you not have 51 votes? But nevertheless, legislation in the United States Senate generally requires 60 votes in order to end debate and get to a point where you could vote on a piece of legislation. It's called invoking cloture. So if it is a divided government, say Senate Republicans hold the Senate, then a Biden administration is going to have to figure out how they get 60 votes to pass legislation. If it's a 50-50 Democrat control with a Biden administration, or 51 or 52, there is going to be pressure to change the filibuster and eliminate it. And that means, it won't happen immediately, but over some period of time, there will be pressure to take away, and then all legislation will go through a much more partisan lens, which isn't to suggest that it's not partisan today. It is. It's highly partisan. It's highly political. But there's still thresholds. And so I think it'll be much more of a likelihood in my mind that the filibuster is eliminated. I think it's harder to do if you have a 50-50 Senate. I think it's a lot easier to do if you have a 53 seat margin or a 54 seat margin. And I think there's going to be significantly more pressure. That plays to the question of what legislation can get through. Tax legislation, for example, if you had to have a 60 vote threshold, it's going to be hard to do. If you have a 51 vote threshold, you only have to rely on the party. Just look at what Bush did. He relied primarily on the party. If you look at Trump with his tax cuts, he relied on the party. If you look at President Obama with Obamacare, he relied on the party. And so it was done with a 50 vote scenario. Happened to be done through what we call budget reconciliation, and I won't go into that whole piece, but it still was a 51 vote scenario. And so I think the question everybody has, is what is the makeup of the Senate? Because that's going to tell me how quickly might those taxes go up, and what are they going to look like, and what's the scope of them? Because if it's going to be done under majority 51 control, then we're going to expect to see higher corporate tax rates. We're going to expect to see higher individual tax rates that'll impact small businesses. There'll be changes in international taxes. How high they go, the negotiation, the timing of them, I think that is all subject to who's going to be, negotiating ultimately, and what does a Biden administration want to see, because you're going to be dealing with companies and an economy that is still going to be at risk. So how fast and how big can all be modulated, right? We know you can phase things in, you can take longer to do it, you can put times around it. But I think we're anticipating certainly that there will be an increased set of taxes, but exactly how it looks like and predicting outcomes, I want to know what the Senate looks like and what the process is going to be before, anyone's really going to definitively say this is going to be the potential outcome.
Great. Thank you for that. We've got 5 minutes before I need to open it up. I'm already getting flooded with questions. We've got lots of people. Keep them coming, folks. Put them on the chat. We'll get as many as we can. My goal is to kind of get as many as we can answered. But let me kind of end this round by asking Toshi to respond to some of what you guys said, because I think it's very useful to get an outside perspective. I think generally speaking, Japan always pays too much attention to the president and the presidential side of it. They don't focus on some of the issues you all just laid out for us. But of course, Toshi Sensei is very different. When you're explaining this to your Japanese students and to colleagues, the messiness of this entire process, where you say, well, why is it this election, the road to the presidency goes through North Carolina? Last time around, traditionally, it's Florida, it's Ohio. Now we've moved on from that. Now we're in the upper Midwest. How do you explain this to a Japanese audience in terms of the American federal and state system? And then what do you think the consequences are from this election, the way Japanese are traditionally used to paying attention? They're used to waking up the next day and knowing who the president is. If that doesn't happen this time, just like some of our primaries, it took weeks, if not months, to get the full election result. What will that do in terms of Japan's confidence in the U.S. system and the U.S.-Japan relationship more broadly, Toshi-san?
Well, I guess we were all ready for a chaos. Period between November 3rd and probably January 20th noon might be the most, unstable period in American political history, right? So all these sort of Japanese television and Japanese newspaper is surprisingly covering in detail about the sort of the presidential election, how sort of the Congress plays in and all that. So, we sort of generally have an idea about what's going on. But like I said, what we always expect from the US presidential election process is the sort of the model case playing out of participatory democracy, as I said at the outset. But you're only sort of seeing chaos. We wouldn't be probably learning who the president is on the sort of the night of the election. And, some foreign powers, an adversary, could exploit that kind of situation. So we're extremely worried. And we're also seeing US being more and more preoccupied by what's going within your country, rather than having a globalist outlook. And I don't think this is just Mr. Trump. You see that on the Democratic side as well. Right? I was reading one of the Center for American Progress report, sort of a recommendation, and they were recommending restrained engagement. Right? And for me, it sounded like a sophisticated version of America First. And Mr. Biden has this Buy American message, which does resemble Mr. Trump's, economic nationalism. Right? So you see this reluctance on both sides. And you see that actually playing out in this election process. And that worries us a lot because Japan needs US to be a resident power in the Asia Pacific. And, we don't think US is going to leave Asia soon, but we're seeing sort of a glimpse of the reluctance playing out in this election. And I guess that's why people are paying much more attention to this election than the past elections.
Thank you. So I'm going to open up to the audience who've sent in a lot of questions. One common theme that they've laid out, and I'm going to have each of you respond to this in different ways from your own perspective. And then I'm going to pick up some specific questions to each of you and give this as a warning to the audience. And one of the questions that comes up a lot from our audience, maybe it's just because people are focused on this, and this is where Toshi Sensei left off. We haven't mentioned the big dragon in the room of China and the impact that this is going to have, but in different ways in every one of our answers, whether you're talking about tariffs as a tactic, or whether it's about American global leadership, or about American economy, or about America's COVID response, China looms large as kind of the other major power out there. And particularly for Japan, it's right next door. It's largest economic market next to the largest alliance, security alliance. How is China factoring into this election? And not just how is it factoring in? Last time in 2016, the big story was Russian interference. This time around, it seems that China is actually a player in its own right, whether it's in the Huawei fight or TikTok fight, or whether it's trying to buy ads in Iowa to kind of get the soybean farmers agitating. How is China emerging as a factor in the 2020 election? And then how do you think, regardless of which president who emerges, where is kind of U.S. policy going to go if it's in a second term of Trump or a new term of Biden?
Well, Joshua, that is a whole set of great questions. I think it's very interesting to me as somebody who's paid a lot of attention to foreign affairs, foreign policy over the years, that China is sort of it's the all-purpose boogeyman for American politicians, and that predates this contest by a good bit. But it hasn't really worked for President Trump the way it did in 2016. I mean, his 2015 early campaign stump message was, nativist and highly, highly anti-China. Remember, he famously said that China was raping the United States. I mean, that was shocking language at the time. And it really helped propel then candidate Trump to the front of the Republican field, because most of the rest of that very Republican field was filled with a lot of traditional American politicians who, while highly skeptical of China and very concerned about the economic competition question, very concerned about the Taiwan question, very concerned about the idea that a rising China automatically meant America losing force and potency and military might in the Pacific. All those things were true for Trump's challengers, but they couldn't voice it. They couldn't give some neat way for American voters to think about what they would do in relation to China. It was very easy for American voters to think about what Trump would do. He's like, I'm going to punch him in the nose. Like, that's it. And that was that bellicosity really helped him. Then he pivoted hard as president and tried to make a trade deal, really courted President Xi. And that in itself, was just such an interesting way for a Republican president to behave. And that is what President Trump hoped to carry into this election, was a who'd have thunk it, much better relationship between the United States and China. Look what I can do because I have a non-traditional approach to foreign policy. You Americans are better off as a result of what I've done as president. So that was the idea about a year ago. And it would have been an extremely difficult one, I think, for Biden to counter. However, we had the intervening issue of the pandemic, which, as you recall, President Trump really struggled to figure out how much he was going to blame China at the beginning. His initial response was, in addition to saying it wasn't any big deal for Americans, his initial response was, China's got it handled. I trust President Xi. He's a strong leader. That's what Trump said in February. It very quickly became a political imperative for President Trump to blame China, which he's now done, for months and harder and harder all the time. And he's lost whatever advantage he originally had of being able to say, I built this great relationship, and we got and you should reelect me as a result. That's all gone completely. The other thing that President Trump has tried to do with relation to China is to paint Biden as somehow co-opted by the Chinese Communist Party. They like to use the name of the party rather than China as a way to draw a distinction between the leadership and the people. It's probably politically smart, although I think it's lost on, on many Americans. They don't really know what CCP means. But anyway, what President Trump is trying to do now is to say that Biden would accommodate China, and that he is potentially somehow co-opted and compromised because of his son's past business relationships in China. That has not really penetrated very far and wide as an election issue, but it certainly is going to outlast this election in terms of U.S.-China relations going forward. I think whoever is president in next year is going to have to figure out what part of the trade deal is salvageable, if any, and where the two countries go from there. And obviously, if something changes with relation to mainland China and Taiwan, in the meantime, that is going to be a defining security issue for the next president, whoever that is.
Great. Let me stick with the U.S., Candy, and come to you. Toshi-san, do you want to jump in right now?
Yeah, can I jump in on China and its implication to Japan?
Yes.
Right. I guess, Josh, you know that Japan is a bit worried about Biden being softer on China. What I would say is that sort of the toughness would remain. I don't think there's any going back to this G2 fantasy, right? That US and China together would sort of set the rules of the world. I don't think it's going to go that way. So the toughness is going to be the same. But in which way or how you would be tough would be probably different, right? Because there's various sorts of ways in expressing your toughness. You know, there's this regime change, as you know, Bannon and Navarro and all those people sort of prefer, you know, see the CCP as the issue. And on the other side, you would be like, remain tough on issues, but try to maintain a stable sort of overall bilateral relationship. So it's tougher, but it's not the engagement policy that you saw in the past. And probably Japan is kind of like that, right? So what I question about the Trump sort of punch one in the nose attitude is that how that relates to an effective competitive strategy. We know that it's confrontational, but what is the end goal? How does that toughness, punch him in the nose attitude relate to a competitive strategy? We're not sure about that. So that's what we worried about Trump's China policy. What we worry about Biden's China policy is that, you know, the Democrats are more interested in global affairs, rather sort of softer issues. There was this Chicago Council on Global Affairs poll sort of listing threat perceptions among, you know, Democrats and the Republicans, right? And on the top of the list of the Republicans' perceived threat, it's China, right? But on the Democratic side, it's global warming, COVID-19, and racial issues. So it's pretty clear that many of the Democrats see the battlefront exist within the United States, rather than, you know, global competition with China. So that's what worries us a bit. So among the policy experts, you have sort of a consensus that you have to be tough on China, but you actually see the more wider sort of Democrats, there are clearly differences, and, you know, the sort of the ordinary sort of, you know, party members do not have a chance to, you know, design a foreign policy. But when it comes to a time when presidents have to make a critical decision, how does those perceptions sort of play into the whole decision process? And also, precisely because Democrats are more interested in global warming and dealing with pandemic affairs, which is important, no doubt, right? But in order to deal with these issues, you have to somehow, you know, negotiate and have a conversation with China. And initially, I believe they would separate the conversational part and the tough part. But there's always, and it did happen in the Obama administration to a certain degree, And those could sort of be muddled, and we don't know what US policy is vis-a-vis China. So that's what we worry about the Biden administration's China policy. So there's,
maybe
worry on both.
Maybe I'll just chime in and kind of conclude that piece of it in terms of, in part, the business view, but also concurring with everyone. If you look at the polling numbers, 77% of the public has a negative sentiment towards China, but there's also, as we noted, a lot of inward focus of the voters, right? And COVID-19 coronavirus has actually turned the voting public more inward. There certainly has been concern around globalization, but you've got this inward sentiment, and therefore any administration, whether it's going to be President Trump or it's a President Biden, is going to have to deal with the fact that you've got a public who's much more focused on what's happening inside our borders and less concerned what's happening outside, and actually wanting to protect what's going on and enhance. And that's sort of your America first, America built, America made sort of sentiment that's coming from a good portion of the public sentiment. I concur that the challenge that businesses had with the Trump administration is, what is the definition of strategic competition? We know there's strategic competition, but business works well when there's delineations of what are the lines. And it's been hard to sort of understand what are the lines in which you can do business in both China and the US, and do it in a way where both countries are sort of putting pressure on businesses that are trying to act in both capacities. And so having some definition going forward from an administration around how do you define a strategic competition with China, and how do you operate? And historically, you separated national security and economic security. That's no longer the case, and the two are now bled together. And how do you deal with those, that dynamic, I think, is a question for both a Biden administration and a Trump administration. But one thing I think, as we sort of look at the challenges, is to remember, certainly as we've been perceiving, and certainly as I've been perceiving it, that there's actually, there's going to be a big focus by the Congress. And I always go back to the Congress on part of this. But I think a Biden administration is going to be challenged from a Congress that is more hawkish, more national security focused, and bipartisan in its support. Some of the biggest proposals that are being pursued, whether it's in a human rights space, whether it's respect to Hong Kong, or it's legislation that is just national security focused and technology focused, has had bipartisan support, whether it's Senator Warner out of Virginia, or it's Senator Chris Van Hollen out of Maryland, or it's some of the House members themselves. There's bipartisan support. So I think, and the Congress has been asserting itself in national security and foreign policy much more significantly over time. And I think the Trump administration has found themselves bound by the policies of the Congress. If you think about Russia and some of the other proposals that Congress has put forward, they're finding themselves bound by laws that are being changed. And I think a Biden administration coming in is going to face the fact that they're going to continue to get pressure, even from their own party, as well as clearly from the Republicans, to be stronger on China, for one thing. The second is there's already laws. What is different is there's a series of executive orders that any new administration is going to have to assess and determine whether they keep them or remove them. But there's also a series of laws. Congress changed its CFIUS rules in terms of how you do mergers and acquisitions. Congress changed how you handle export controls, which is where a lot of these entity lists are being created, and you have this technology challenge. You've got changes in law with respect to Hong Kong and reports that have to be issued. You have changes in law that are coming that are going to be with respect to the Uyghurs. So any administration is going to have to enforce those laws, and they're going to have to work within those confines. And so I do think you're going to continue to see strategic competition with China. Ultimately, the question is, how forceful, and how much do you enforce those rules? But I think there's going to be some bipartisan pressure coming from Congress, so that the trajectory with respect to China, specifically as it relates to technology and AI and surveillance and kind of the tech war that's been going on, that's going to continue. And I just see two paths, with more alliance And I think a Biden administration wanting to work more closely with Japan, to work more closely with Australia, to work more closely with the EU, to bring together allies to continue to put pressure to try to come up with a path, with pressure on China with respect to technology. Some of the other areas maybe less so, but I think it's hard to see a different trajectory. It may be a different style, but I think you've got to acknowledge that there are changes that have occurred as a consequence of the Trump administration that are now baked into law and harder for a new administration to really deviate from where those policies are headed.
Great, thank you. Let me do a rapid round of questions to each of you specifically from our audience. And then the top question everyone's asking is who will win. So I'm going to ask each of you at the very end a rapid round, kind of your thoughts on that. But Anne, we have a specific question here for you, which says, would you say that the rise of white supremacy in the upper Midwest with the anti-lockdown and the anti-mask movement, we saw the governor of Michigan and the foiled attempt to capture her from the FBI, how is this playing out? Will this have an impact on the so-called Trump breach that you talked about in 2016? How does this play out with all the issues going on with kind of the call for racial equality and justice playing out in the country right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a very sophisticated question, and I don't know the answer to it. It certainly is true that Trump took the lid off some ugly sentiments and politics that predate him, but he certainly has made it okay for people to say things in public and behave in racist fashion in public that really were not done for decades in this country. It looks and feels different than the open racism of a generation or two ago, but it is certainly the public face of racism and white supremacy has changed and become more public and more free to more freely expressed in the last 4 years. That is something that if Biden were to win, he's going to have to deal with. There is a real ongoing hardened constituency in American politics that simply will not accept a Democrat as president and will kind of form a permanent resistance. Part of that permanent resistance overlaps with the white supremacist movement, conspiracy theories, all kinds of things that are running rampant and which are extremely dangerous and divisive, potentially dangerous and divisive forces in American politics that are going to outlast this presidency and outlast this president if he wins another term. And I think it is an open question whether the various things that we lump together under white supremacy play a factor in this role in this race, whether there's an actual measurable effect. I mean, many people who express those views are Republicans. Many people who express those views are not regular voters. We don't know whether the fear of a President Biden and what that might mean is going to drive more of those irregular voters to the polls this year. Certainly President Trump hopes so, but he can't say, hey, everybody, hey, all you white supremacists, come out and vote for me. He has to be more subtle about it. And he is being, for him, rather subtle about it.
Toshi-san, I have two questions. One is from a young American currently teaching English at a Japanese high school in rural Japan. And they ask, what can I tell my students about this election? I think it's triggered by what you said about your son. What do you say to your son about this election and kind of the confidence? So that's the personal question. And then let me add a policy question on it. there's a question about what happens to the free and open Indo-Pacific policy. We saw Prime Minister Suga just make a speech about this in Vietnam, so it's clear that Japan is taking it seriously. What do you expect from the next administration, whether it's Trump that has embraced this under Mike Pompeo's idea of kind of free and open Indo-Pacific, but what do you expect from Biden as well? If you can take those two quick questions.
Right. Well, the first one is a tough one. You know, I hope she's having a good time in Japan. You know, and she's playing, because U.S.-Japan relations is not just the alliance, right? It's a multi-layered alliance. We have the sort of the civil society relations, business relations, you know, alliance relations. So her coming to Japan and teaching Japanese kid English is much more stronger than President Trump or you know, politicians shouting on TV. So I think she's playing a very important part, you know, in the future sort of development of this bilateral relations. So, you know, I thank her for doing that. And, you know, what she can sort of tell the students about this election. Well, I guess, you know, Japan has been relying on this alliance, although this reliance goes both ways. We haven't really verbalized, talked about how important this relation is. We sort of take it for granted. Right? So I guess on the Japanese side, we have to talk more about why we select the U.S.-Japan alliance or U.S.-Japan bilateral relations. Not that we exclude others, but we see it as the most important. But we sort of tend to forget the reason why we do so. So I guess Japanese society as a whole have to sort of, what I always keep on saying is that re-select the alliance. Right? And try to sort of, you know, try to explain to ourselves why we do so. And we have to be more sort of forthcoming in because we tend to say that, you know, for Japan, there's no other options. U.S.-Japan is the only option. So that's why there is the alliance. But there has to be a more positive reason to it. So we have to sort of verbalize a positive reason why we select the U.S.-Japan relations and the U.S.-Japan alliance. And for the second part, the Indo-Pacific, this Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific policy comes from a structural sort of background. It is not attached to a certain, you know, political environment in Japan. And I do believe that this notion, this concept would be carried on to another administration. We don't know if the term FOIP itself would be taken up by the Biden administration. Maybe not. But I guess the concept itself, because it is based on the structural reality in our region, and even more, you've renamed your Pacific Command to Indo-Pacific Command. That sort of, you know, sets this term on a more stable sort of foundation. So I'm not too worried. Maybe the specific term FOIP, Biden team will change it, but the whole concept and the whole notion would, I think, basically remain whoever wins the election.
And Candy, for you, before I do the rapid round of your all's responses, given that we've only got 7 minutes left, there's a lot of questions here about kind of the traditional pro-business Republican community that's lined up behind every Republican, including Trump last time around. Are they beginning to switch to Biden because of what they're seeing in the polls? What are you seeing in terms of kind of the business community and what it's trying to do to mitigate risk for itself moving forward? Does that mean that they're all moving in mass over? We heard the president yesterday in a speech say that if he wanted to fundraise, he could call up anybody, including ExxonMobil's CEO, to ask for $10 million. I think that's generated a whole question about how are Wall Street and the titans of business thinking about this election?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we've seen with the fundraising, Vice President Biden has had pretty strong and pretty large fundraising opportunities. I don't really want to go down the path, of who's supporting whom. I haven't really looked at all of the numbers in terms, but I think the question you're asking with respect to the Republicans and kind of the support for those who, so some of the demographic shifts have certainly occurred. And I think if you look at the numbers, President Trump has held fairly firm on approval ratings, just as the campaign's been fairly steady in terms of where the numbers have been. The president's approval numbers for the last couple of months and actually previously have been fairly steady. Those approval numbers are holding on average in the mid 40s. He trades in a fairly narrow trading range, somewhere between sort of 39 and 46, 47. And I only raise that because that number reflects the fact that there's a significant percentage of Republicans who support the president when polled. That number can be anywhere from the 90s down to the upper 80s. To be honest, I haven't looked at the polling numbers recently for the breakdown to sort of say what percentage is supporting. I think there is a weakness in some of the Republicans, clearly, who, particularly college-educated white Republicans, who have been moving to the Democrat Party really since, a bit in 16, definitely in 18, and we see the shift here in 2020. So I think there's a softening, but is it a wholesale shift? It's if you've got someone who has on average 45% approval, and you ask, within the Republican Party, are you supporting? He's still getting a fairly significant number.
Great, thank you. So for the lightning round, I'm just going to ask each of you the same question to respond. And starting with you, number one, where are you going to be on election night? What's your drink of choice? And then who do you think is kind of, if you had to bet your money right now, who'd you vote for, and what's your drink of choice to give us a sense of what your night's going to be like?
Okay, I expect I will be in Washington, although I've volunteered to be part of the strike team if we feel that they're going to be election night and day after legal challenges. So I might end up being sent out someplace to help with that. So I can't fully answer that. Drink of choice will be tea until there's a winner, and then wine. And if there is no winner, I'm going to have to decide that, knowing that night, I'm going to have to decide when and if to shift to wine. And as a working journalist covering the race, I can't offer a specific prediction. I will say that both campaigns, as recently as yesterday, confidently predicted that they will win, and one of them is wrong.
Toshi Sensei, what are you going to be doing maybe in Japan in the morning time, hopefully? What are you going to be, where are you going to be? How are you going to be watching the live coverage of this? And then what do you expect, and what will you be drinking?
Well, I'm going to be on TV for the whole day, probably starting out in the Japan time on the 4th, in the morning till night, almost, constantly. And I don't know, I was doing the same thing on 2016. And I totally embarrassed myself, as you all did, I guess. I started out by saying, it's Clinton would be the winner, but I was totally wrong. And I almost went silent about it because I was so, not embarrassed about myself, but I was kind of shocked, right? So I hope that wouldn't happen, But it's pretty clear that we're not going to see the election on that day. I mean, on November 4th, Japan time. So I don't know. I'll keep what I'll have for drink when we know the election, and hopefully that will be in the year 2020. But maybe that will be in 2021. I don't know. But probably, I don't know, sake or something.
Okay, great. Candy, to you, where are you going to be? How are you going to be watching this? And what are you going to be drinking with your, if you make a prediction?
Yeah, I'm going to be sitting at home here in Virginia, probably with my family and a lot of wine. Not a big sake fan, but depending on how much, maybe later on. We run the risk that this could be a really long night. It's one of those things. Keep an eye on Florida. If President Trump's right and he's winning Florida, then it could be a longer night. President Trump is wrong and Biden wins Florida, it's going to be an early night. I think it's going to be easier to call because the path to victory is a lot harder. So we'll see if we're still drinking wine and sake for 4, 5, 6 or weeks or not.
Well, great. I want to thank all of you for joining us. This has been fabulous. We could just keep on doing this for hours. At least I could. I love this stuff. I'm totally a political nerd at heart, but I really appreciate the way you guys have brought this perspective together for us, for the community here at Japan Society that values your all's political insights and also the implications of this. This is not a laughing matter, but I'm glad that we're able to have a little bit of fun. I hope all of you that were watching were able to get as much out of this as I was. I hope all of you are able to stay safe in this environment. You're able to get out and vote no matter which side you are. And that, just like Japan Society is looking forward to working with whoever the next president is, and whether that happens on November 3rd night or whether it takes a couple of weeks or whether either way on January 20th, we'll be looking forward to supporting the new president as we look towards another term. And either way, the U.S. Japan alliance, I think, as Toshi and others have said, is stronger than any one individual or one political movement. We're hoping that everyone is able to cover this and to follow all of our fabulous speakers. We'll put some of their information in the link that comes out afterwards. Thank you, Ann Guerin from the Washington Post. Thank you, Toshihiro Nakayama from Keio University. Thank you, Candy Wolf from Citibank for joining us. And thank you, the viewers, for joining us. Thank you, and good evening there in Tokyo, and Ohayou gozaimasu, and I hope everyone gets a good start to the day here on the East Coast. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.